All right. So is a transparent CBDC worth it, right? And so where we're kind of going with this is having more observable transactions, right? So basically kind of throwing transaction privacy in what you're spending money on in terms of the goods and services you buy with the CBDC, basically throwing that out the window, right? This is another alternative as to having a more private CBDC or a more private transaction privacy policy, we'll say, which is kind of an alternative to this video. Anyways, so kind of defining transaction privacy. So according to a paper published by the Office of Science and Technology from the White House, transaction privacy concerns which entities are able to access which characteristics of transactions. And this includes data privacy, right, which basically means, the account balances, the location of the participants, so you and your counterparty, or information about the goods and services you're buying with it. But there's also program privacy, which includes like the source code and inputs, maybe if you're using this for like smart contracts of some form, right? Whatever that happens to be, right? And so one of the points, we'll say, for having a more observable transaction private policy and is basically maintaining a public record of all transactions associated possibly even with pseudonyms, right? To where basically if you're looking at the ledger, you're not immediately, it's not like your name or a specific number specific to you, whether it be like a social security number, an employment identification number, or whatever other numbers, maybe it's separate, I don't know. Just kind of throwing ideas out there at this point. But having pseudonyms for you that basically only specific intermediaries or entities like we'll say the Fed or some central bank in general has, and basically that only they can use to, we'll say, read the ledger, right, and see who it is, right? This could also have some characteristics or only some of the, we'll say, transaction attributes are actually recorded on, say, a public record to begin with, and then others may be more private or not even recorded at all. Again, kind of defining what exact transaction attributes are recorded, and if they are, should they be made public, right? Or at least with respect to the intermediaries in the system, right? And again, to what degree? Because it's really, when we're talking about stuff like this, there's not really so much black and white. It's kind of varying shades of gray in terms of how much privacy for which exact transaction attributes and that sort of thing, right? So to look at some of the pros and cons of having this more observable transaction privacy policy, right, for a potential US CBDC system, right? So one of the pros would be it promotes AML and CFT compliance, which again is anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism compliance, and basically using those with respect to having pseudonyms, right? So like you'd have a pseudonymous form that's on the ledger that, again, only those specific intermediaries can maybe follow or whatever. And that also raises the question of how good is that pseudonym to begin with, right? That's a separate question, though. I'm just kind of throwing that out there. And basically the whole point of having a pseudonymous, ledger in that point, or system, whatever you want to however you want to describe it, is that only, we'll say, as they say in the paper, competent authorities would have access to it. And then again, how secure or how easy to break are these pseudonyms to find out who exactly you are? Again, questions to be asked. But regardless, another kind of pro of this is it may help support economic activity. And so basically their argument for this is public info about the characteristics of transactions may help understand consumer preferences, right? That's, again, try not to put my own opinion in these specific videos too much. But again, arguing that the characteristics of your transactions should be made more or less public, or maybe be able to be, we'll say, sold to specific entities, or if, say, like, businesses or whatever want to have that data, then they can essentially buy it from intermediaries to find your customer preferences and basically market to you in certain ways, right? Through the CBDC system. I'm not arguing right now for other systems in general, or what we already have in this respect, right? So to continue, kind of the negative consequences of having a more observable transaction privacy policy would be authorities have access and could share that data, allowing for vectors of possible leaks. Again, having that information leaked or available to be, I guess, hacked, for lack of a better term, by malignant actors, we'll say, and kind of leave it there, right? So, and this is even with the pseudonymous identities. I don't know why I can't talk this morning. It's pretty typical, apparently. But basically, vulnerabilities in these pseudonymous methods could lead to anonymization in the future, right? Basically, your identity is out there and that sort of thing, to where you're no longer anonymous in terms of outside entities who are supposedly not competent being able to find out that information, right? And this itself could reduce public trust and user adoption in that system itself, right? So one thing to keep in mind is all of this could also be placed with an access tiering, with basically, like, you could have different, however they decide to, or would decide, or could decide to kind of segregate transactions in different tiers, whether that be like, transaction amount, time of day, who the counterparties are, type of transaction, whatever. It could be used so that only transactions of certain amounts or by certain people are recorded. So again, kind of whether it's in terms of transaction privacy, what transaction attributes that are recorded, and let me try to articulate that better. So with respect to the attributes of transactions, only specific attributes could be recorded depending on which tier that transaction would fall in, right? So if you're sending money to, or if you're transacting with a business, then maybe they have, the amount, who the business is, what you're buying, at what time, and those are the transaction attributes that are recorded. Whereas if you're buying from, say, if it's like a peer-to-peer transaction with this, maybe they only do the amount and the person and not what you're buying, right? And then again, how are they going to report that and all that sort of thing? Who has to report it if you're the one selling it to someone, like if you're at a garage sale or whatever, just throwing out an example, do you really have to report that somehow? And then what is that going to do to user adoption? Because I mean, like, if I were having a garage sale and I had to be like, hey, I sold my old PS3 or whatever to this person, then I don't want to have to report that. Like, that's going to significantly dock user adoption. At least I would think so. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. And kind of a final note is all of this happens in varying degrees, right? Kind of touched on this a little bit earlier with the varying shades of gray, so to say. But varying degrees of transaction privacy could be used for transactions based on multiple factors. Again, end user, the counterparty, the amount, time of day, whatever, right? You name it at this point. When it comes to this kind of a potential US CBDC, a lot of these design choices are kind of just being placed out for discussion, is kind of what I'm doing here, right? And so it's not necessarily that this is how it's going to be. It's these are potential ones, or these are design choices that must be considered in looking at the pros and cons of the different directions each one could go, right? Because to really gain an understanding, you have to have a holistic view of the system itself. And so I'm kind of trying to understand the different directions that each design choice could go, and with that foundation, therefore going on and trying to gain a holistic understanding of potential systems that could pop up, because it can change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, because each one has different requirements that they need, or they have different legal requirements, legal systems, that sort of thing, different standards, whether it be legal or whatever. So it could change, right? With that being said, I'm going to place in cards in the top right and bottom right for a more private transaction policy, and then also layering transaction privacy policies, right, in the right side of the video. So with that being said, hope to see you guys on one of those.